So, shall I start? A very good afternoon, everyone. I am Anushka Dhillon, and I'm working as the Innovation Manager under the Edu Reform Project at the Maharaja Sayajirao University of Baroda. Today, we have our Edu Reform Expert Talk series, and the speaker for today is Dr. Alpesh Maisuria. I welcome you all to this talk. But before we proceed further, I would like to give you brief information about our project. So this particular project is being co-funded by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union, and it aims to mitigate the impact of the fourth industrial revolution on Indian society, education reform for future and in-service school teachers. So what exactly is the fourth industrial revolution? It is related to automation, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, and all these things have caused a very serious and a global concern. That is unemployment, especially in India. If you see, according to the People Strong report, in India, 1.5 million jobs will be lost annually due to automation. Also, according to the World Economic Forum, the demands for skills is changing. The focus is coming towards analytical thinking and innovation, complex problem solving, critical thinking and analysis, creativity, originality and initiative, active learning strategies, etc. So it is extremely important that we prepare our Indian society, education being a crucial factor. So as Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam has said, education is the most powerful weapon that we can use to bring a change in this world. We at EduReform are trying our best to motivate our teachers, that is future and in-service school teachers. Elda, next slide, please. Our aim is to empower the future and in-service secondary school teachers so that they are able to develop the students' critical, analytical, and creative skills, to shift the focus from rote learning to actually understanding the subject. And through this objective, we try to create a national best practice to support the Indian national authorities to successfully cope with the societal challenges which are directly related to the fourth industrial revolution. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as an innovation manager, I, along with 3 other innovation managers, will participate in the preparation and implementation of all project milestones. And we all will ensure that whatever work we are doing, it is sustainable. The changes that take place should not be there only for 2 years, but the changes should be there for a lifetime. And to give a more better understanding on our project, we have a very special guest with us, that is Dr. Alpesh Maisuria, who will be speaking on education and crisis, a critical education perspective. Dr. Alpesh Maisuria is Associate Professor of Education Policy in Critical Education, University of the West of England, UK. Through underlaboring Marxism with critical realist philosophy of science, his work examines the ideological and political drivers of policy decisions to critique the role and function of education in reproducing forms of inequality. Having completed his PhD in Sweden and taught about the Cuban model of education for many years, he has a comparative international education interest. In these areas of critical education, he has an extensive publications record, and he has been decorated for his efficacious teaching. Dr. Alpesh is the Joint Deputy Editor of Journal for Critical Education Policy Studies. He is also the organizer of the International Conferences on Critical Education. He is the co-convener of Marxism and Education, Renewing Dialogues. His areas of interest include sociology of education, education policy, critical education, Marxist theory, critical realism, and social class. We all welcome you, Dr. Alpesh, and the floor is all yours now.
Fabulous. Right, let me see if I can, after that amazing introduction, let me see if I can actually use Zoom. Right, so let me see if I can share my screen. Right. I can't see what you can see. So which screen can you see at the moment?
Okay, now we can see it full screen now.
You can see it full screen. Fabulous.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so thank you very much for this invitation, and thank you to those people who have made the effort to join us today. Hopefully I can provide you with a stimulating and perhaps different, perhaps a controversial presentation, because my presentation on education and crisis will be very much critical in its nature. That's my background. I'm a critical educationalist, and I've got various different roles. The role that I'm going to be speaking from today is very much as probably in a personal capacity, but also as one of the editors of the Journal for Critical Education Policy Studies, which is a free online resource, peer-reviewed international journal. And I know that we get a lot of hits from India and other parts of Asia too. So I encourage you to have a look at some of the work on there, because all of it is from a critical educational perspective. So as I say, my talk will be critical, and perhaps for some it might be a little bit controversial, but in any case, I hope that it's going to provide you with something a little bit different to some of the other talks that we've had so far in this series. So I'd like to begin with a provocation. And the provocation is something which I would like to have hanging just throughout the course of the next kind of 30 minutes or so that I'm going to speak for. And the provocation that I'd like to leave hanging is this: what is the role, function, and purpose of education in contemporary and future society? And I'd like you to think about this provocation throughout the course of what I'm going to be saying, but particularly in the context of two things. The provocation in the context of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. There's been much discussion of 4IR, as I'm going to refer to it. And I think almost all of it, generally in the public domain, has been extremely positive. And you'll see imagery like the one that you've got on the screen, and it just looks fantastic. It looks like it's an image of a trajectory of progress and civilization. And this kind of imagery is often used and put into words by organizations like the World Economic Forum. You know, if you go on to any of their statements, you'll see that they're incredibly enthusiastic about the Fourth Industrial Revolution. I know there's different terminology, but I'm going to simply call it the Fourth Industrial Revolution, or 4IR. And as Anushka said, there's going to be potentially some serious negative impacts as well, but we don't really hear much of the negative impacts. So I hope today to elucidate on some of those and explicate some of those negative implications and consequences of things like automation and AI. So, one of the things that the Edu Reform Project has been very keen to stress is that there's going to be an estimated 1.5 million jobs per annum every year in India. And there'll be similar kinds of devastating consequences elsewhere. So what is the role and function and purpose of education in contemporary and this future society that's been depicted for us? There's also a second context that I'd like you to think about my provocation. And this is around COVID-19, the global pandemic. What do we want society to look like after COVID-19? How will society be remade for us? What's it likely to look like? What do we want it to look like? And how do we fight for this vision? And I think these two things, 4IR and society and social structure post-COVID-19, are central questions for us to consider as part of our response to the provocation, what's the role, function, and purpose of education in contemporary and future society? So in terms of this provocation, helpfully, the EduReform project has provided something of a response. And this is what I've got from the EduReform flyer, okay? And I suspect there's people in the room who have written this flyer or edited it. So the response is this: education and skills development are key factors in the man or machine debate. Technological advancement across various industries will lead to a rise in demand for a more skilled workforce. Policymakers will need to reevaluate current education and skilling programs to prepare workers better. Now you'll see that I've highlighted three particular elements of this general statement, which is, I think, a good statement. I think it's an effective statement. And these three ideas or three elements that I've highlighted are things that I want to play with and subject to critique in my presentation here. The first one is worker versus machine dichotomy, or rather man or machine. I prefer the terminology worker rather than man. Demand a more skilled workforce. The word more is important there. I'm also going to be playing with the idea in my presentation for the next kind of 25 minutes or so about preparing workers better. And what do we envisage that to mean in the future? And what I'm going to do is provide a critical education gloss on these, particularly from a Marxist perspective and a critical realist perspective, which is where I come from. Okay, that's my background. In my wider work, I specify three interconnected roles and functions and purposes of education in specifically capitalist economies. Almost every economy in the world is a capitalist economy. And so I do not think that you can address my provocation or think about 4IR or any other things that are going on at the moment without knowing and recognizing and acknowledging that education is not separate from capitalism. Education sits within capitalism and its economy. So in my wider work, I tend to talk about three different areas. These are broad kind of areas. And the first one is labor power creation for value production. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And just so we're on the same page, because I realize that these might be unfamiliar terms to people in the audience today. Labor power is basically the capacity to work for a wage and to produce an output. That's what labor power is. So we're all using labor power. I'm using labor power now whilst doing this presentation. Celia is using her labor power to administer this presentation. Value production then, well, this is about your output. Your output has a financial return for your employer, whoever your employer is in the capitalist economy. And that might not be so obvious, but we all have an employer, unless you're part of the 0.01% of the super rich class, okay? So everybody has an employer. We all work for somebody, whether that's an individual or a company, okay? So this is what I tend to talk about in my wider work. And also, I'm going to be talking about specifically today, but also in my wider work, I talk about commodity production. and also the way that education has been used. So education becomes a commodity in labor, in capitalist economies. And I also talk about the way that education is used to mystify, in other words, confuse people about labor power and value production and these ideas that we're working for someone or some organization. Okay, so to reiterate, education has to be understood as part of a general understanding of the way that capitalism operates. And if you miss capitalism from education, whichever element of education you're interested in, whether it be children's education, whether it be higher education or teaching or whatever, I think if you miss capitalism from that dynamic, you really only have a half-baked picture. You don't have a comprehensive understanding. So you've got to situate education within capitalism to have an understanding of its role, function, and purpose in contemporary and future society. Okay, but you've also got to situate the fourth industrial revolution within capitalism as well. You see, what we've got to understand is that the fourth industrial revolution is extremely positive and presents an opportunity for capitalism and capitalists. Because what's happened over the last 18 months, for sure, but also over previous years, has been that capitalism and its profit margins has been destabilized somewhat. COVID-19 has been something of a crunch moment in economies which have been crippled through people having to isolate, through people not being able to be part of the productive economy, through people not being able to produce outputs through their labor power. That means that profit margins have decreased. And so this represents something of a crisis moment for capitalism. It's been destabilized more than ever before. And as I've just alluded to, the fourth industrial revolution presents an opportunity for capitalists to restabilize capitalism and provide even more profit than in previous years for capitalist enterprises and individuals. So it's absolutely crucial to understand education and also fourth IR within capitalism. So we've got a particular historical conjuncture, and I think that we've got to underpin our understanding of this conjuncture with COVID-19, with 4IR and education. All together, they're all part of a conjuncture. They're all dynamics within a historical conjuncture to have a fuller understanding of the status quo. And in order to have a fuller response to my provocation at the beginning about what the role and function and purpose of education may be and how that might alter in the future in this historical moment, well, we've got to take these different dynamics, COVID-19, 4IR and education together, and provide some kind of response to my provocation within the context of capitalism. And that's what I'm hoping to do today. But also, I want to take it a little bit further forward as well. Not only understand and appreciate this historical conjuncture, but also how we as educators or critical educators could and ought to respond to the objective of social justice through education. So these are the elements that I want to talk about. These are the take-home messages that I want from my presentation today. Let me switch tacks somewhat with some historicization. The COVID-19 crisis and what's often called the falling rate of profit in Marxism is just one crisis. It's just one crisis in the multiplicity of constant historical crises. And this crisis will not destabilize capitalist equilibrium out of existence. In recent history, what we've seen is various crisis moments. And I've listed a few of these, and obviously we don't have time to go into any level of detail. But in 1929, there was a global fiscal crisis after Wall Street crashed. Similarly, there was a financial crisis after 73 when there was an oil crisis and the price of an oil barrel went through the roof. And most recently, there was obviously national crisis in between, but these are global crises. And most recently, most of us have lived through the 2008 banking crisis, where the banks nearly collapsed because of what happened in the in London and in the USA. These have all been crisis moments for capitalism, but none of them have pushed capitalism out of existence. The 2020 crisis after COVID-19 and the invention of the fourth industrial revolution will not push capitalism overboard. What we've seen at each one of these crisis moments for capitalism is that capitalists have been able to utilize their capacity to reboot capitalism. And the fourth industrial revolution will be used in that context. It will be used to restabilize capitalism, and it will be used to push up profit margins for the dominance of capitalism to maintain its hegemony in the future. And I think the general point here that I'm making here is that the revival of capitalism will happen through the fourth industrial revolution. I think it will be used as a key lever to reboot capitalism. Obviously, the fourth industrial revolution is an unknown at this moment, and it provides the spice, I would say, to the way that the capitalists might respond to this particular conjunctural moment. So when capitalism has one of its downturns, irrespective of the reason, and I've mentioned some of those reasons there, the crashes, the crises, the epidemics, the pandemics, the capitalist ruling class globally and its institutions, and I've mentioned one of them already, the World Economic Forum, will force a resuscitation of the capitalist economy globally. In Britain, after the 2008 crisis, the capitalist revival was through austerity measures, pulling back public funding of public education, for instance. But certainly within Britain, and I would suggest also in the United States of America, people are sick and tired of austerity. So austerity will not be used as a lever to reboot capitalism this time, and instead a new political strategy will be needed. And this new political strategy will obviously involve the fourth industrial revolution, but it'll revolve mainly around a key focus. And that is how to enhance output from workers to aid the capitalist global economy through an increase in outputs. Okay, so workers will be the focus. The focus will squarely be on us as workers, people who use our capacity to work, our labor power, as I said right at the beginning, and we use our labor power to create value for the capitalist economy. Ultimately, every single one of us needs to create more value than it costs to employers. This is called surplus value in Marxist terms. Put simply, there's a pound or a rupee or a euro sign above our head and a number. This number is your salary minus your output. Your output has to be deemed to be greater than your salary. This is what all forms of capitalism has been in the past and will be in the future. We know, particularly from 2008, after the financial crisis, what this means for us as workers. It means that we have to work more for less in all industries, irrespective of who we are. And practically, this more for less manifests in various different ways. One of the observations that we can easily make, certainly from the British context of of education is that when somebody retires or leaves a job or a post, they don't get replaced, at least not immediately. Instead, what we'll find is a middle manager. They're trying to look for people who have space and capacity within their contracted hours to fill the gap. So we're having to work more for less. In the worst case scenario, a cheap worker will be drafted in the university system. In Britain, this means postgraduate research students are drafted in to take teaching roles particularly. Or technology might be used for a blended or a hybrid approach. These are, kind of really sexy terms at the moment. Blended approach, it's advertisement now. And in England, particularly, there's been various language and terminology that's been used. Things like flexibility. We need to work more flexibly. We need to be more responsive. We need to be more agile. These are all terms which are used within education at all levels and generally in society. And it basically means, in reality, we have to work more hours. We have to produce more output for less. Less meaning security, pay, prospects, job satisfaction. This is what post-2008 capitalism has meant for almost all of us in education and society more widely. Now, I want to point out that education workers are slightly different to other types of workers. We don't produce value in the same way as, for example, somebody who works in manufacturing. Somebody who works in manufacturing can have a tangible product or a commodity that they produce. Instead, what we do in education, or at least what we're supposed to do in education, is produce a pipeline of workers. The cost of employing us as workers must be cheaper than the pipeline of workers who we can make work ready. Okay. In this way, we as teachers and educationalists generally are really, really central and important for capitalists, particularly in times of crisis. And we're important in various different ways. But as educationalists, we help nurture the mentality and the skills of workers to be productive for the economy. And skills like resilience, skills like obedience are very, very necessary, particularly at moments like now. And there's also this ambiguous concept of employability, which it's a really slippery term. It's an ambiguous term, but it seems to amount to cultivating a bespoke kind of individual who is willing to work ever harder, longer, and produce more output. And certainly in the English context, at the moment in England, we've got something like 13 universities that are kind of on the precipice of bankruptcy. And it's quite common in these types of universities to hear a middle manager or a financial accountant in these institutions, or even a politician, an education minister, say something like, we need to embed employability into our pedagogy and our curriculum. Employability becomes a real kind of core focus in terms of our curriculum and our pedagogy. We need our graduates and our pupils to display resilience. So let's have, and what we have now in England are things which are called mental wealth modules or resilience training, right? I want to say something else here now. I think you're kind of grasping my point, but I want to say something else here now. The apparent deficit in resilience in particularly younger people, and people know about the depression crisis that we've got in lots of different countries, particularly among younger people. The resilience deficit is always blamed on the individual. So individuals are blamed for being depressed and having bad mental health rather than the system. The system is never problematized, okay? So the fact that most young people nowadays will have poor prospects and bad working conditions, low pay, they'll be constantly on the precipice of being replaced by somebody who's even cheaper than them, well, this is their fault. And they're just going to have to go through resilience training to cope with this. And this is particularly bad if you're from a poorer background, if you're from a working class background, or if you're a woman, or if you're in a minoritized group, or if you're disabled. All of these things become much more tougher for you, and you have to gain more resilience from somewhere. So resilience is a metaphor for coping with inequity and injustice. In Marxist terms, this is called exploitation and alienation. These are concepts which I recommend to people to go away and have a look at. But these are not new problems that we have. For the last 40 years, the neoliberal capitalist model and its economy has been using education in terms of its policy to create labor power and to cultivate the mentality and the skills of the next generation of workers. So education is absolutely central. And as I've said, with AI, robotics and automation, we're likely to see a radical restructuring of education for a new labor market and a new social structure. And I think what this will look like is not pretty, quite frankly. Sorry, this has been quite a depressing talk, but this is the reality that we're facing, right? This new labor market and social structure, so this future scenario with the fourth industrial revolution and capitalism after COVID-19, well, there'll be fewer higher skilled jobs for qualified workers than there is now. And that will be because machines will do these jobs, okay? Machines are much better for capitalists. Machines are more resilient, they're more obedient. They don't get sick, they don't get COVID-19. Machines don't need to take parental leave. Machines don't have mental health problems. They don't have trade unions to fight for industrial relations. So over the long run, they produce more output, which means more profit margins. They're better for capitalism than humans. And alongside this, and the consequence of this will be that there'll be a larger pool of people vying for medium and lower skilled jobs. And by the way, these people will be qualified. They'll be perhaps highly qualified people, but they'll be qualified for jobs which they're not going to be able to get because there's going to be a saturation in the market, in the labor market. And that means there's going to be people competing with very high levels of skills and qualifications and credentials for fairly low skilled jobs, okay? And education will be central in creating the conditions to make this normal, to create the mentality in people that they have to work longer for harder for less, okay? So there's going to be masses of changes, significant changes for education. And just as an aside, I wonder what will happen to the nature of education more generally, where we'll be able to fit criticality in our curriculum and pedagogy. What will happen to child-centered and progressive education methods and pastoral care? And the aim and objective of education being for social justice. And there's been various people who have written about this. And I really like James Avis's work and Martin Allen and Patrick Ainley's work. They produced from around kind of 2013 onwards. They've been writing about capitalism creating something like a different type of pear-shaped economy. What the capitalists want us to believe is that we've got a kind of a pear-shaped economy, a pear-shaped social structure, which is like the pear on the left-hand side of your screen here. So there's very few people at the bottom, and there's a lot of people at the top. And social mobility and meritocracy exists. So if you work hard enough, and if you've got the natural skills and talents, then you'll be rewarded in society and you'll rise to the top. Hey, it's a great society to live in. This is what the imagination is for most people. But actually, what Martin Allen and Patrick Ainley say is actually, no, this is not true. Since the 1960s, certainly in Britain, what we've got is a social structure and an economy, much like the pear on the right-hand side, where you've got very few people at the top and a lot of people at the bottom. There's a bulge at the bottom, Okay, what my prediction will be after kind of the use of 4IR and COVID-19 is that that bulge at the bottom will become extremely bigger, much bigger. It'll become greater. The bulge will become greater at the bottom. So I'm going to start to wrap up for the next few kind of slides or so. The key points that I want to draw out so far is that capitalism is inherently exploitative. It relies on labor power and output, okay? It relies on everybody working to generate outputs for the global economy. But because of the destabilization that we've had through COVID-19 and other crisis moments stemming from 2008, particularly for this generation, there's going to be an opportunity from 4IR for capitalism to restabilize and also expand exploitation of labor power. That's what my previous slide was all about. So I'm not so sure, going back to my earlier slide about the leaflet from EduReform about what the future looks like. I'm not so sure that it's a straightforward dichotomy between worker and machinery. I think workers will be needed to facilitate machinery. There'll be lower levels of jobs for higher qualified people to facilitate machinery to do that work for output. Capitalism would love to, and this is what my friend and collaborator Richard Hall talks about in his work, capitalism would love to get rid of its reliance on labor power, because as I said, people go off sick, they demand higher pay and promotions and things like that. So capitalism would love to get rid of its reliance on labor power. And I think 4IR will shift us towards that realization potentially. And in respect to going back to the second thing that I highlighted on the leaflet, more skilled workforce, I'm not so sure. I think the skilling may actually be de-skilling for some people, right? Or at least people willing to have a different type of mentality in the restructured social structure and economy. So people will need to basically be content and acquiesce with simply facilitating machines in producing value. So they might be reduced to a highly qualified person with perhaps a PhD, with maybe perhaps many years in the classroom, might be reduced to pressing a button, and that button might be recording lectures, which might be reusable by universities. This paints a pretty depressing scenario. And I think so the next thing that I highlighted on that leaflet was preparing workers better. So as I said, preparing workers better may mean that getting the next generation to understand that higher qualifications and credentials and ability and effort may not be rewarded as part of a meritocratic and socially mobile society. That just simply will not be the case. And education may have a role, purpose, and function to kind of keep people rooted, to keep them down, to say to them, look, just remember, if you start to raise your head above the parapet and start to complain about your working conditions and your prospects, then there's somebody else in line who's going to be cheaper than you to employ. And so that's the mentality that education might need to cultivate in the next generation of workers. And as educationalists, as critical educators, we need to recognize the likely scenario of 4IR. And I think we should think about how we can resist. Talking about 4IR is simply the first step, okay? But I think what we can all do as individuals and collectives in organizations like trade unions is to keep in check and provide critiques, constant critiques of what's happening in terms of education policy, post-COVID-19. In the British context, there's been some very, very dangerous moves to privatize large sections of the national HE provision, okay, to make them operate much more like businesses. And it's seemingly gone under the radar, partly because of COVID-19 and the predicted rise in cases and deaths in the winter. There's been some serious policy changes. Most people don't recognize them. So what we need to do is keep in check, keep recognizing that these things are happening and provide critiques of them in our classrooms, with our friends, with our colleagues, and raise them in our meetings, in our staff meetings, in our labor organizations, in our trade unions, in our political parties that we're part of. We also need to keep in check and provide critique of the way that Fourth IR is reaching into education. And some of these are subtle changes to curriculum and pedagogy, and some of them are much more overt and direct. But specifically, putting these changes in the way that 4IR is reaching into education and contextualizing them in terms of labor power and output. So that's keeping in check and providing critique. But I think we need to do even more than that. I think we need to provide alternatives through progressive organizations, as I've said, like trade unions and political parties, individuals who are powerful. You know, there's actually a whole bunch of very, very rich people like George Soros, who believe that the inequality in society is not sustainable. And George Soros, remember who he is a multi-billionaire, right? And he's saying that we need to reduce the inequality gap. I don't think he's mainly doing it for social justice reasons. He is worried that there's going to be an uprising from people, from particularly young people and workers, from the new conditions that they are facing in the future. But he is potentially an ally for critical educators and other types of educators to say, look, let's just keep in check and think about what 4IR is doing post-COVID-19. And we need to be doing this in the context of the injustice and the inequity that we will see in the future post-COVID-19 and the introduction of 4IR. So I apologize for providing a very bleak picture this afternoon for you in India and this morning if you're in England or in Europe. I've managed to give you a snapshot of my thinking there, but there's a whole bunch of people who have influenced me and writings that I've produced in the context of the things that I've been talking about today. So labor power, commodification, and mystification. And so I've highlighted some of these references of Patrick Ainley's work, James Avis, Martin Allen. And in December 2021, and January 2022, there'll be an encyclopedia that I'm editing with 50 of the leading authors in critical education that'll be published by Brill Publishers, and Martin and James and Patrick have got contributions to that encyclopedia. There's also other people who have talked about the impact of coronavirus, people like John Preston and Rhiannon Firth. And I think Glenn Rikowski's work, the one at the bottom of your screen here, has produced the most compelling and accessible writing on labor power and Marxism and commodification of education and labor power that there is perhaps in the world. And I recommend these people's works. And obviously a lot of the ideas that I've talked about have come from my own work. And here's a couple of my books, Life of the Academic and the Neoliberal University. I've mentioned universities several times, and that's really kind of a lot of my focus, where my focus is. And also I've talked about a little bit of mystification, and as part of mystification also comes feasibility. So we've got to provide, in our role as educationalists, a different type of future. So rather than saying, look, this is what the bleak future looks like, and we've just simply got to settle with it, providing some kind of alternative future as well. And so in the final chapter of a book that I've got there called Class Consciousness and Education in Sweden, I play with the idea of feasibility. We've got to provide an alternative which looks feasible and people are willing to fight for, particularly younger people. And that could be around climate change, which I've not mentioned at all, but obviously that's really, really impactful at the moment. Or it might be around kind of 4IR, or it might be around kind of post COVID-19 restructuring of society. And generally, my point here is around the concept of hegemony or hegemony. It's a Gramscian term, which is really, really important. And I talk about this in this book at the bottom here, Critical Reflections on the Language of Neoliberalism in Education, which is a great book, which touches upon many of the ideas that I've introduced today as part of this very brief sketch. So thank you very much for listening. I know it's a depressing talk and it was 40 minutes, so it's quite kind of intense. Hopefully you've managed to get something of use, but I think we can move into the next stage of today's session this morning.
Thank you, Alpesh. I think this is definitely going to leave us thinking as a part of EduReform, and for some of us as being also young people in this society right now. So we have a few questions from our consortium. The first one comes from Graham Burns, who is at our partner university, YAMK School of Applied Science in Finland. So he's asking, is it true that there will be less skilled jobs in the future? Perhaps we should not forget that as new fourth industrial revolution tech comes online, new supporting industries, each of which will create other types of skilled employment opportunities. And of skilled employment opportunities will be needed just as it happened with the third industrial revolution. So he thinks basically that new high-skilled jobs also will emerge with this revolution. So what is your thought on this?
Okay, so there won't be less skilled jobs, but there'll be less high-skilled jobs. That was a nuance that I made. And I think that's absolutely got to be the case if the capitalists have it their way, because these high-skilled jobs also mean higher salaries, okay? But if you can get a machine to do a high-salaried job, then it's going to be much better for the capitalists. That's a straightforward, dead straightforward kind of bit of logic there for us. I think there'll be perhaps a different type of skilled job in the future, and there might be more of these. So people operating machinery, and I don't necessarily mean kind of big machinery in car plants and things like that. It might be machinery in university departments or in schools. It might be, something to do with IT departments, because we're going to need much more IT and technologists, as they're called now, in universities. Because that's the direction that we're moving. Just think about our experience certainly my experience over the last 18 months. I've been forced to learn 3-4 different new platforms, how they work, including this morning, Skype, how to share, So, we're going to need different types of jobs, but there's certainly not going to be more highly skilled jobs. It's just logical that the capitalists are going to want to reduce kind of salaries in order to increase profit margins. And one way to do that is to have less highly skilled jobs.
Yes, that's true. Actually, when you were discussing about the fourth industrial revolution and COVID, we also can argue that the sharing economy has increased the amount of low-skilled jobs. So now we're using a lot of Zomato in the case of India, Deliveroo, so these kind of platforms that are providing workers with jobs that are, I wouldn't say highly skilled.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, whatever happens, look, the key message is that there's going to be a complete restructuring of the type of work that's going to be available, and also the kind of labor that's going to be available as well. And we can think about this in whichever way that we want to. I mean, the World Economic Forum think about this in a very positive way. I obviously don't. I think it's not going to be good for workers, and particularly younger workers, minoritized people, and poorer workers.
So we have another question from Shivaji University from Dr. Patankar, the coordinator of Edu Reform in this institution. She is asking if the education is only for creating skilled jobs, what about the wisdom and the knowledge? And if capitalism will exploit the education system, what is the solution then?
Sorry, can you repeat the final part of that question? I missed the final.
She's saying that if capitalism will exploit the education system, what is then the solution?
If you've got the answer to this, please tell me. It's up to us to remake society. We have agency, we have autonomy. It's obviously relative and it's obviously, you know, kind of curbed. But Marx has this amazing quote, which is that people can make history, but not in the conditions of our choosing. People can make history, but not in the conditions of our choosing. So nobody wants to make history in this current climate. You know, we wouldn't choose this current climate to make history because it's not a nice climate, but we still have the capacity to change the course of history. And, you know, this is where I would bring in the concept of hegemony. You know, Antonio Gramsci, the Italian communist, was writing very, very clearly about the role and function of us thinking with the concept of hegemony. So history is moving through a particular course of direction. It has been for 40 years. And what that has been is kind of capitalism has been trying to deepen the neoliberal version of capitalism. But it doesn't mean that that's what history has to be forever more. We can change that. We can change that in different ways. We can change it through the political system. So we can do it through the power of voting and elections. I know kind of there's problems with particular countries. I've got to be careful about what I say here, given the audience. There's particular problems with the political system in some countries in terms of fraud and who can vote and how and why. But we can change it through, we can change the course of history through democracy, what democracy exists, or we can change it through direct action. And it's up to us to make a judgment about when to use democracy and when to use direct action. We can use both. It doesn't have to be one or the other. And this is where, in my view, some communists get it wrong. Some communists think that you've just got to kind of, you know, break down the structures of the status quo, you know, go and kind of infiltrate the government and, you know, kind of like the French did, cut off their heads. You can't do that. You know, it doesn't work like that. Hegemony will not allow that now. We don't have that kind of culture. And so you've got to work in cultural forms. You've got to work through democracy. You've got to work in direct forms. And the direct forms might be marches. It might be you know, starting petitions. It might be lobbying particular ministers. You know, sometimes things work, sometimes they don't. Yesterday, in the British context, the Secretary of State for Education was effectively sacked. That's because there's been a sustained criticism of his leadership and the way that he is trying to privatize British universities. And so, you know, kind of people power worked. People power can work, and that's what we've got to do. So the wisdom and the way that kind of people's knowledge. Well, I think what we're going to see is the fourth IR trying to use wisdom and knowledge, so trying to recraft it, reconfigure what wisdom and knowledge means and what education means for for profit margins. But we can resist that. We can resist that that movement and that shift.
Thank you. This is more of a helpful answer. So we have also a question from one participant from the YouTube live stream, Naivandu Yoshi. He's saying that most developmental activities build surplus for people with rich economic, cultural, and social capital, and deficits for those who lack such resources. So is there a way to prevent this trend for the fourth industrial revolution, to prevent this trend?
Yeah, and again, it's up to us how we use technology. technology can be harnessed for social justice purposes. It's just that I don't think it will be. That, you know, that's kind of that's my headline here. But it's up to us to use it, you know, so we can decommodify our knowledge as educators. So, you know, we can publish in copyleft outlets, for instance. So rather than only having our work available with big publishing houses that make massive profits and make knowledge and wisdom, to go back to the previous question, make that commodity, you know, rather than make our knowledge and wisdom only commodities, we can publish it through things like academia.edu. We can publish it on other sites, you know. I won't mention LibGen, but LibGen's very, very useful for people, particularly in the global south, to access, you know, books which are very expensive. And I mentioned JSEPS earlier. You know, as an editor of JSEPS, we are extremely proud that we have some of the best writers in the world, and we don't charge anything to access the articles that they are publishing. These are peer-reviewed, high-quality articles, and that's what we can do to, you know, kind of allow knowledge to be and wisdom to be accessible to as wide as audience as possible.
Okay, I think that each from the questions from the consortiums and the participants, but I would have a last question for you. From your presentation, we understand that education has been brought up under capitalism, like it's already happened. So in capitalism, we can observe that there's a trend that to establish, I wouldn't say monopolies, more like oligopolies in certain industries. So we can say like Amazon dominates the market, or I think everyone can think about many other businesses doing the same in their sector. So is higher education gonna do the same? I mean, will we end up with like mega universities, mega like global private universities or schools?
That's already happening in the British context, or in the English context, sorry, because we've got devolved governance in Britain. That's already happening. So we've got mega schools, they're called chains, they're chain academies. In the USA, they're called charter schools. In a much smaller way, in Sweden, they're called free schools. So we've got a chief executive officer now that runs, you know, 50 schools in some places. The more schools you have, the more profit margin you can potentially make. That's yet to happen with universities to a wider extent, but the Secretary of State for Education, who was sacked yesterday in Britain that I just mentioned, his name is Gavin Williamson, he was trying to move and accelerate the process of mergers of universities. So the various privileged and elite and exclusive universities, the idea was that they will start to take over less privileged universities, less esteemed universities. And so you got much bigger and the benefit for capitalists is that they can spread their resources, right? So if you've got two universities will have an accounts manager, they'll have two, research managers, or innovation managers, sorry, Anushka, you know, but if you merge the university, then you only need one, right? So you cut the salary by half. That's what's happening in individual universities, and that will happen in the future with much bigger universities. And that was the shift and the trend that the former Secretary of State for Education was trying to push us towards. But as I say, you know, let's not lose hope. There is hope, but it's up to us to take this on the, you know, kind of take responsibility for the future course of history and do something about it in a very small way that we can do it.
Thank you. Don't worry, Anushka, we will not make you work at another partner university so far. And I actually give the floor to you, Anushka, to continue this expert talk.
Thank you, Celia. I request Mr. Marco Ghelardi, who is the theatre director and drama teacher from Liceo Artistico Paolo Candiani, to please present the vote of thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, teachers and students online. Yes, my name is Marco Ghelardi. I'm a theatre director and mainly a drama teacher at Liceo Candiani in Italy at the moment. And I do hope you all enjoyed this expert talk as much as I have. I've been asked to give a vote of thanks on behalf of EduReform and the Liceo Candiani to all those who made this event happen, and I do feel honored to do so. So first of all, I would like to thank Dr. Alpesh Mesuria for his provocative and lucid talk about the role of education in a time of crisis such as the one we are living now. It was very enlightening to discover what is behind words that at first sight sound like neuter and proper descriptions, but that hide specific set of values that impact directly our world. Certainly, the talk was controversial, and we need to thank you for that, and welcome the chance to face a different way of thinking and a different way to look at things. I believe nobody could listen to your speech without pausing a moment to think again about the time in which we're living, but allow me to disagree with you on one point. I don't think your presentation was depressive, rather the opposite. The passion you bring to the analysis and the awareness of the role of education in 2021 is palpable. And I believe every one of us listener will take with him or her an input and a wake-up call on our role as educators and teachers. So thank you, Dr. Alpesh, to have given us so much in such a little time. Although I would like also to thank Ms. Anushka Dillon and the EduReform Innovation Manager for a focused introduction of such an ambitious project. Education is the best weapon to change the world is a great quote that will stick with many of us. Let me assure you of that. Now let me address Celia Guetomelo and Alda Tolumi. We are all grateful to you to have set up this event and make it happen. We know how complex it is to network through different continents and time zones to bring everyone together, even on online platform, and you have performed your task brilliantly. And thank you so much for having the patience to go through the pronunciation of all your names with me, and this extends to Anushka as well.
That's my pleasure.
I would also like to thank the EduReform Consortium as a whole and everybody who participated in making this event possible. There are too many to mention, but each contribution had been important. In the EduReform project, we are trying to share knowledge, and it is events such as this that help making it a reality. Finally, thank you everyone for taking the time to be here today and for listening to me speak. I'm grateful and honored for this opportunity. Goodbye, everybody, and thank you.
Thank you very much for everyone's participation and for organising this and your vote of thanks there, Marco. That was very much appreciated. Thank you all, and do take care. Hope.
Thank you very much, everyone, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.